I never knew Monstera plants produce fruit until I found the fruit that it produces, and this is that fruit. It's edible, but there are actually some unpleasant consequences that can happen if you eat the fruit unripe. I knew I needed to cut it open and taste it for the first time, and try planting it to see if I could grow fruit from my own Monstera plant indoors. Now, this fruit is actually considered a delicacy in many places, and the reason why Monstera is called deliciosa is in reference to this tasty edible fruit right here that the plant produces. You know that it's edible after the little green hexagonal scales start to fall off and it starts to smell really good. Once the green scales start to lift and break open really easily, you reveal a creamy white flesh that you can eat. Unfortunately, this one is not quite so ripe yet, and remember those consequences I was talking about earlier if you try eating the fruit unripe? Well, that's because the fruit contains little needle-like structures that can irritate your mouth and throat. Those little needles are called calcium oxalate crystals, and it can actually create a burning sensation in your mouth that can be really itchy. So this is probably the most dangerous fruit that I've ever tried. But when it's ripe, the fruit is considered edible and safe for humans, and it tastes like a combination between a banana and a pineapple. And it smells like a passion fruit and a strawberry. And it's the most wacky fruit that I've ever seen in my life. You're probably also wondering why I'm ripping it apart while it's still unripe. Well, I put it in a cup to let it ripen a little bit more, but I found this fruit in the States and I live in Canada, so I knew I wasn't gonna be able to let it ripen fast enough before my journey back to Canada. So I unfortunately had to say goodbye to my fruit salad plant and hello to just my Monstera plant. But then when I got home, I was so intrigued by that fruit that I got an idea. I had this Monstera cutting that I got from a friend, and I thought to myself, I wonder what would happen if I spent a few years growing this into a mama plant and then try pollinating it indoors and making it produce fruit. After all, I just wanted to see if I could grow my own fruit from my own Monstera plant, and in Canada too. So my new journey began, and 2 years never passed me by so quickly. My baby seedling grew into this plant. Slowly but surely, it kept shooting out new leaves. I even time-lapsed a few to show you how the leaves dance and grow in real time. I kept repotting it when it outgrew its pot, and soon, the plant looked like this 2 years later. I never even knew Monstera plants could shoot out leaves without holes, but that was something I figured out along the way as I grew my own from a small seedling. And the leaves, they can't make more holes because the holes are already formed since the plant starts growing shoots. But as young plants get older, they start to shoot out leaves with holes eventually. So I was really excited when I got the first hole on one of the leaves. But as my Monstera plant morphed from a baby into a teenager, by now years had passed and it still wasn't as big as I wanted it to be in order to actually produce fruit. And I knew I needed to take action if I wanted to grow my own Monstera fruit. And one day, I was scrolling Facebook Marketplace and I saw that someone was selling a huge Monstera cutting for $10. And I thought this was the perfect idea to be able to grow my own fruit. So I picked it up, brought it home, repotted it with some Epsom salt for magnesium and some vermiculite and perlite and potting soil for aeration. And I watched as it started to grow bigger and bigger. I actually got a few plants out of this. And I thought, surely I'm on the right track to growing a big enough Monstera to hand pollinate it and eventually make it fruit. I watched as it shot out more leaves and I waited very patiently. I knew that in order to pollinate it by hand to actually grow fruit indoors, I needed to get it to flower. And if I could get it to flower, then I could identify the male and female flower parts, collect pollen from the male using a small brush or cotton swab, and then carefully transfer the pollen to the female parts, ensuring good contact for successful fertilization, and then my fruit could grow. But the problem was that another year had passed after adopting this plant and still there were no flowers. And they usually produce fruit way faster outdoors, being pollinated by insects like bees and butterflies. So I knew that even if it did produce flowers, the odds of growing fruit from the plant would be kind of up in the air, especially with Canadian weather. And during this time, my friend Max came over to drop his dying Monstera plant to my plant hospital because I always accept any and all plants to help save them and revive them. And I very very quickly accepted it because I noticed how thick the stems were, and that meant that this plant must be an older plant and all it needs is some TLC to revive it and then maybe it will fruit. I repotted it so that I could try to help it thrive and survive, which, by the way, it now looks like this 6 months later, and in my mind, I knew that I had my teenager Monstera plant that I grew from a seedling, a huge Monstera plant cutting from Facebook Marketplace that was doing really well, and now this plant with huge, thick stems from my friend Max that still needed some time to flourish and grow. So even though I knew I needed to give my plants more time to flower and fruit, I decided to take matters into my own hands and go find a flowering Monstera with fruit already growing so I could become more educated about how the fruit grows so that when I go back home and a couple more years pass, I'll be ready for the odds of the fruit growing to be much higher. And during this time that I went to see these plants, I found out that apparently plants vibrate and produce faint sounds that can be detected by sensitive equipment. These sounds are often inaudible to humans and they're typically at frequencies much lower than what we can hear. But listening to plants make music is actually possible through electrodes, and I wanted to see what my Monstera plant would sound like. Even though this isn't technically backed by science, I still decided to put electrodes on both sides of my teenager Monstera leaf, and then I guess electrical signals were translated into different pitches in the form of music. It's even been suggested that plants may use these sounds as a means of communication, like signaling to nearby plants that they're being attacked by insects. When I put the electrodes on the plant, this is what it sounded like. So, anywho guys, the truth of the matter is, in the midst of all of our Monstera plants, I guess we just found the tastiest yet most dangerous fruit to ever exist, and one that grows on the coolest plant ever. So, you already know that I will not stop growing my Monstera Swiss cheese plants until it has a fruit baby, even if it takes a few more years. So, you're stuck with me, guys.